Welcome back. In the final lecture for this week, we will look at our 3 assigned secondary source readings: the introduction to the Playing in the Past book, an article on teaching historical theory, and an article on teaching history through the use of PC games. Before we begin, this is a reminder that you should have already made your discussion posts before you listen to this lecture. As we discussed in our second lecture, these readings qualify as secondary sources, as they are not contemporary to the time period that we are discussing. Each of these sources is likewise scholarly, as they appear in a scholarly press and in an academic peer-reviewed journal, in this case, the History Teacher. On the other hand, our short reading from Polybius was a primary source. Our first reading was the introduction to our main course book, Playing with the Past, by Andrew Elliott and Matthew Kappel. In this introduction, titled "To Build a Past That Will Stand the Test of Time, Discovering Historical Facts, Assembling Historical Narratives," Elliott and Kappel discuss the complex process of constructing historical narratives. They begin by looking at the importance of the book's title and why they ultimately settled on Playing with the Past, rather than other options. A book's title is very important, as it indicates the central concerns for the work. In Elliott and Kappel's case, they were concerned with the relationship between video games and their complex, changing, and multifaceted association with history. Two options that the editors considered early on for the book were digital history and video games and historical engagement. They decided against these titles, though, as they seemed to suggest that the main argument of the book was one of two extremes that they wanted to avoid. Either, in the case of digital history, that video games could act as a historian and do history, much like some have argued that cinema could do history. Or, in the case of video games and historical engagement, that video games themselves could not offer any view into the past, and that only through traditional academic study can people come to know the past. Elliott and Kappel ultimately settled on the title we see now, Playing with the Past. Not only does this represent the importance of the experience of the actual playing of these games, but their title highlights several important questions that are asked in the book. Namely, what is the past? How does it relate to history? And how do we represent both of these ideas? These questions of the past and its representation become interesting as players can ultimately influence the outcome of the past, altering the course of historical battles, wars, and civilizations during their gameplay. Thus, how is history represented when it can be simulated, recreated, subverted, and rewritten by players? This issue of historical representation is ultimately at the core of Playing with the Past. Elliott and Kappel go on to explain what specific aspects of historical representation they want their readers to understand. Thus, they imagine history not as history with a capital H as an academic study, but rather history with a lowercase h as simply the past, accessible to people through a wide variety of avenues and closely related to the present. They likewise incorporate the technical term ludic when referring to the act of playing video games. Despite it not being a perfect fit, Elliott and Kappel suggest that this term, from the Latin for game, ludus ludi, embodies the fact that games are meant to be played and experienced, as well as understood and watched narratively, as well as the fact that playing is an important individual and social aspect of human behavior. Elliott and Kappel next explain exactly what they mean by engaging with history through games. The notion that video games can have a serious impact on learning has already been addressed by a number of scholars and theorists, such as Stephen Johnson, James Paul Gee, David Williamson Schaefer, and Kurt Squire. Instead, Playing with the Past approaches these questions of historical representation from the perspective of history rather than from the perspective of game studies, which often focuses on accuracy and nostalgia. In making this scholarly approach, Elliott and Kappel highlight 3 important theoretical questions that must be answered to form the foundation of these discussions. These questions are, first, what do we mean by history? What kind of history? Second, what do we mean by games? Can all games be treated the same, or do different kinds of games engage with history in different ways? And finally, are historically themed games even trying to teach history? After posing these questions, Eliot and Capel once more insist upon viewing history not as the study of the past as a series of facts and movements, but rather the concept of the past, considered as a whole, in which these facts, movements, and events have combined in a certain way to lead us to this present day. As we discussed in the second lecture for this week, Eliot and Capel discuss notions of historiography. While this term is often relegated to scholarly use, its meaning is plain enough: the history of history, or the study of history. The important distinction here is that of the historian versus the history that they retell. E.H. Carr describes the historical process as a historian taking home all of the historical facts to their home and then cooking them up and serving them in whatever style they see fit. Carr's description reveals the very subjective, relative, and human side of our ongoing historical narrative. History relies upon both what facts are chosen as well as how they are put together and presented. Eliot and Capel encourage readers to recognize the inherent fallibility of history as a discipline itself and its lack of objectivity. Historiography, then, while certain facts and objectivity of course remains important, is in many ways the act and the study of creating history. Eliot and Capel point to three important elements in creating and shaping the historical narrative: the selection of facts, the assembly of facts to form a narrative, and the person doing the shopping. First, the selection of facts. This process acknowledges limitations of historical facts both in what is chosen by the historian for selection, but also in which facts are available in the first place. In video games, as in any form of representation, it is impossible to show every fact or detail. Thus, developers must pick and choose what to include. It is also a mistake to view this process as a fact-based approach, as this assumes that historical accuracy is the main goal of the video game. Like with film, game developers must choose to sacrifice some of the historical facts to improve the gameplay and the player experience. In the struggle between the rules of history and the rules of the game, the latter usually wins out, and in doing so can perhaps better shape historical consciousness despite its cost in historical accuracy. Second, the assembly of facts to form a narrative. It is necessarily true that historians will tell histories in different ways. There is no exact scientific method for the construction of history. Likewise, because we are writing at the end point of all these facts, it is uncomfortable to think that we are merely the byproducts of a series of accidents and chance encounters. So we very often, albeit unconsciously, impart a sense of teleology into the narrative, a sense that we are the inevitable end result of things that were meant to be, something known as historical determinism. Since teleology describes a goal, objective, or endpoint, a teleological narrative is simply the presentation of something as an inevitable conclusion. Thus, historians can reach vastly different conclusions even while using the same facts. Two cooks with the same basket ingredients rarely result in the same dish. A great analogy that Eliot and Capel use that you will all be familiar with is a CV or a resume. This document has been written, edited, rewritten, and re-edited again and again with each new job you apply for. The reason for this is that your CV is written and rewritten to lead someone into believing that you are the ideal candidate for that specific job exclusively. All of the facts of your past, your education, your work experiences, your leadership, all suddenly point clearly towards preparing you for this specific position. Just as a person's past can be rewritten in any number of ways, selecting different facts each time, so too can the historical past be rewritten to construct the present as an inevitable progression from the then to the now. Third, the person doing the shopping. The third element to the construction of history is the person themselves. This is the shopper, according to Carr's cooking metaphor, the we that present, select, and assemble the history in the first place. This brings into the construction of history the biases of the individual or the community, even if subconsciously. Intentional alteration of the historical narrative is possible as well, exemplified by the video game concept of modding. in which players themselves alter the historical narrative in order to enhance our ability to engage with it. Again, it is important to remember that despite the scholarly baggage tied to historiography, these questions are not limited to only academic historical inquiry. Museum curators, filmmakers, and game designers all wrestle with the same questions and elements of constructing history that the academic historian does. This notion of public history has long been looked at and studied by scholars such as Jeremy Black, Raphael Samuels, and Jeremy DeGroot. Given these elements of constructing history, Elliott and Capel explain the need to question not only the reliability of these historical representations, whether it be a game, an exhibit, or an academic work, but also the nature of historical representation in the first place. Ultimately, Elliott and Capel maintain that the real focus of this book is not a discussion of the historical accuracy of video games in a narrow, tiresome sense, but rather a look at historiography. That is, not how a video game deviates from the historical record, but why it chooses to do so. Briefly looking at Assassin's Creed 3, Elliott and Capel explain that the creative director, Alex Hutchinson, worked hard to maintain the historical accuracy of the game, but at times diverged from a strict accuracy to improve the gameplay, and thus, in some ways, as historian Francois Furstenberg relates, ensure that the game's overarching narrative remained historically authentic. With the essays in Playing with the Past, Elliott and Capel want their readers to consider how these games engage with history and popular culture, asking what kind of engagement, who is doing this engagement, and what this engagement means for our understanding of the past. Notions of historical accuracy become difficult to expect from video game designers when, as we have just discussed, there is not consensus even amongst historians of an objective sense of history. Also at play with game designers is the question of intention. If the designer was not trying to accurately represent the past in the first place, it is useless to criticize the game for not striving for historical accuracy. Even if this is the case, though, it is neither helpful nor sincere to simply put these games to the side as no longer a part of the historical conversation. After all games are marked by player activity rather than just a static portrayal as with a film. Games are played, while films are merely watched. Indeed, Espen Aarseth describes video games as a process rather than an object. Thus, in many games, actions that the player takes become virtual actions in the historical past. Using Espen Aarseth's model, Elliott and Capel break video games into three main characteristics, not unlike the four aspects that we outlined in the previous lecture. These are the gameplay, the player's actions, strategies, and motives; the game world, fictional content, topology, level design, textures, etc., and the game structure, the rules of the game, including the simulation rules. Elliott and Capel go on to describe each of these characteristics in turn, emphasizing the ways in which historical games can offer players insights into history by emphasizing history to unfold as a process and by teaching the lesson of contingency, the effect of past actions on present realities, and why certain historical events unfolded in the way that they did. The constraints that game designers choose, or choose not, to place upon a game to adhere to the realities of the historical past ultimately result in different learning outcomes. A more strict historical accuracy on the one extreme, and more theoretical understanding of the past and of long-term historical developments on the other. Also central to games is player agency. While agency is what makes video games a unique form of media and provides game designers with immense potential to allow players to experience the past in one form or another, it also creates certain barriers to the pursuit of historical knowledge. As both scholars and game designers admit, there is often friction between historical accuracy and a game's playability. And even with good intentions from designers to accurately represent the past, how a player plays and experiences the game remains out of the designer's hands. While academic history has the goal of knowledge, video games are ultimately designed to be played. Thus, video games encounter a serious hurdle to the construction of historical narrative, as they ultimately hand over the control of the assemblage of the facts to the players themselves. After all, it remains the player's prerogative to choose how to play and experience the game, regardless of the designer's intentions. However, where video games more effectively represent the past is through the very nature of the gameplay, allowing players to understand the past not simply in terms of dates, events, and people, but in terms of the complex discourse of contingency, conditions, and circumstances. Such an approach allows for more enjoyable engagement with the past, providing players with a playground of the past. The focus then is not on historical accuracy, but rather on historical authenticity. It is the responsibility of the historian, Elliott and Capel argue, to allow non-historians to do their own assembly of the past, and thereby expand their enjoyment and understanding of the past. Games such as Oregon Trail and Civilization, in which individual actions, actively chosen by the player, can have far-reaching effects, teach players historical causality, even if the specific details of the game are not always historically accurate. Especially in strategy games, players can experience firsthand the interconnectedness of historical events and the very real nature of historical contingency. The importance of choice, then, the assembly of the historical narrative in-game, works to undercut a notion of inevitable historical causation, in favor of a counterfactual experience in which player decisions have a realized effect on the outcome of history within the game. Without a doubt, video games offer a great tool for a variety of fields in the formation of narrative, whether viewed as a historical narrative or in the study of narratology more generally. Yet despite the fact that storytelling remains one of the key aspects of any video game, the most important aspect of games, and one that has been understudied by scholars, is that of gameplay. The fact that they are ultimately games to be played, not stories to be read or watched. In this study of gameplay, known as ludology, the emphasis is on both the rules of the game as well as player behavior. In Playing with the Past, Elliott and Capel utilize both of these approaches to understand how video games engage with the past, recognizing the fact that video games are meant to be played by players within a set of rules and mechanics, as well as the fact that history within video games is ultimately a historical narrative that is selected, assembled, and played. The importance of the narratological lens as opposed to the ludological lens varies from game to game. A few questions to think about with this reading. First, there is a delicate balance between historical accuracy and good gameplay. What do you think is more important? How much of each needs to be maintained? Can it be dangerous or harmful to recreate the past inaccurately or anachronistically? Number 2, which set of characteristics do you think better defines video games? The 3 aspects from Aarseth's model or the 4 aspects discussed in the previous lecture? How do these different models affect the way that we might consider video games? And number 3, what do you think is more important to allow players to learn about history in whatever form it takes from video games, narrative or gameplay? Are Elliott and Capel right that both are fully necessary and that at times one is more important than the other and vice versa? The next reading we will look at is the article PC Games and the Teaching of History by Andrew McMichael. This article looks at how McMichael brings video games into his Western Civ course at Western Kentucky University, ultimately hoping to teach his students how Western culture packages, uses, and consumes its history. PC games help in a number of ways. First, they can make students more engaged and make the material seem more relevant to them. Second, they can allow students to see the relevance of multiple facets of history to their own lives, as games can present a view of history that has the potential to become ingrained in our culture. And 3, the use of these games in the classroom can teach students to think critically about how history is used in our society and how this affects our understanding of past events. Video games also allow for teachers to help students understand the holistic narrative of history in ways that simple lecture and class discussion may not be able to do. For instance, explaining the relationship between distant historical events across time and space, thinking about history as a chain of events. McMichael goes on to look at some of the literature behind the effective use of video games in the classroom. You will notice him citing Kurt Squire, who appeared through the introduction to Playing with the Past, in arguing that from video games, students can learn to frame historical arguments and explore factual and counterfactual themes through computer simulation. Looking at such counterfactuals and attempting to create their own historical narratives in games such as Civilization, students begin to ask why things turned out the way that they did in the historical record. In many ways, this article is a reflection from McMichael on the steps he took to incorporate video games into his classroom, including his process of deciding which video games to incorporate, how he went about purchasing the software, technology issues the students ran into, and the problems associated with these tasks. He ultimately settles on Civilization 3, Patrician 2, Europa Universalis 2, and Age of Empires 2, which he spends a good deal of time describing over the next few pages of his article. McMichael hoped that these games would offer students different focuses on gameplay and strategy, including both micromanagement as well as macromanagement. As students play these computer games as homework assignments, classes were spent discussing the difficulty of gameplay and the ways in which the historical narrative of a PC game differed from what students encountered in lectures, primary source documents, and textbooks. McMichael's main course objectives were to show students the historical connections between the past and present, and to teach students an understanding of society and human behavior. Thus, students analyzed the ways in which the present was connected to the past through the public discourse of video games. Ultimately, students were asked to consider how history is presented academically versus how it is presented for public consumption and why these two might differ. Throughout the course, McMichael relied upon essay assignments to evaluate what his students were learning from playing these video games. Relying as well on supplementary lectures and readings, other questions explored in his course included what makes something a civilization, and in what ways do civilizations develop, progress, and prosper. Here, aspects such as geographic determinism and structure of government were explored both in history as well as in Civ 3. McMichael likewise asked his students to analyze the ways in which these video games portrayed important historical issues such as gender roles, military combat, and religion, pushing students to develop a complex argument relying on evidence as well as evaluate these games as constructs of history. Concepts such as historical change over time, the decisions of game developers to leave out certain themes or facts, whether due to biases or based on marketing and gameplay strategies, and the role of the military as an agent of change, and a sense of Western historical determinism all found their way into these classroom discussions. Once again, we see the common theme of balancing historical accuracy with marketability and gameplay. McMichael's class discussed this range of acceptability in developers compromising historical accuracy, whether for gameplay or due to modern sensibilities regarding race, gender, sex, and violence. Such sanitation of history, again, sheds light onto the interesting connections between past and present. In the final section of the article, McMichael concludes with some advice to his fellow teachers who might be interested in bringing PC games into their own classrooms. A few questions then about this reading. First, many games are sanitized or whitewashed in various ways to adhere to modern sensitivities, even at the cost of grim historical accuracy. Should games be sanitized in this way? What are the pros and cons of such a reconstruction? Number 2, does gameplay necessarily have to clash at some point with historical accuracy? If so, at what point? Does this vary by genre? Finally, A. Martin Wainwright's article, Teaching Historical Theory Through Video Games, also discusses the advantages and logistics of utilizing video games as a major element of his course. Wainwright explains that most scholarship surrounding video games in history has centered on the high school classroom, and those that do look at university education often look at the benefits video games can offer as a form of counterfactual history. In his course at the University of Akron, however, Wainwright argues that through video games, his students are actually able to understand complex ideas from both gaming and historical scholarship, as well as historical theory, that typically is not approached until the graduate level. Ultimately, It is through the process of discovering the games that students learn historiography. Before discussing the specifics of his course, Wainwright discusses his class demographics over the 3 semesters that he has taught, in terms of race and gender, as well as academic major. Perhaps not surprisingly, the students enrolled were a majority white male. The course itself was broken down into 7 thematic sections: game mechanics, economics and environment, cultural bias, world systems and world history, determinism and contingency, combat and brutality, and finally, gender. While Wainwright utilizes a variety of games throughout the semester, the central game and the only one required was Civilization IV. Civ 4, he argues, offers students and players sophisticated options that are less deterministic than in previous titles. The game likewise focuses on the effects that religion has on the civilization's productivity, internal loyalty, and international diplomacy. As we have seen with the previous 2 readings, the basis of Civ 4, running the gambit of much of human history, not to be confused with prehistory, offers a grand sweep of world history, allowing players to make connections between events, developments, and technologies across time and space. Wainwright goes on to break down each of these thematic sections in his course in turn. In game mechanics, students explore the different mechanics that embody different video game genres, much like we did in our previous lecture. In exploring a number of games, Wainwright looks at the range of player options and freedom, as well as how heavily the gameplay focuses on historical detail. In economics and environment, the class explores resource management, production, and efficiency. This in turn leads to discussions of geographic placement, exploration, and hierarchy of resources. In addition to discussing environmental impact and environmental history in this section, Wainwright explores how Marxist theory argues that economics is the main driving force behind history. In the 3rd thematic section, cultural bias, Wainwright underscores some of the accusations that have been levied at civilization as having a Western capitalist bias, following the familiar post-colonial accusation of Orientalism founded by Edward Said. He likewise acknowledges the weakness of Civ 4 in its sweeping, deterministic, and sometimes inaccurate bonuses that the game gives based on the civilization and its chosen leader. Again, the question of detailed historical representation versus more general historical authenticity comes into discussion. The next section on world systems and world history discusses the advantages that some grand strategy-focused video games can have at simulating connected events and states across multiple continents. Despite the opportunities that this raises, these games at times fall short as well in their portrayal of these systems. Despite the opportunities that this raises, these games at times fall short in their portrayal of these systems. A lack of plague as caused by complex commercial interconnectedness, a complete lack of slavery as a historical reality or economic commodity, and a larger lack of economic detail in general causes these games to fall short and miss some further opportunities to simulate a more genuine historical narrative. Students critique these games for such omissions, exploring why game designers chose to include certain facets of history, whether due to modern sensitivity or for some other reason. Wainwright's 5th section is determinism and contingency. By discussing counterfactual history as well as their own simulations of alternate history in their gameplay, students are able to indulge in historical speculation. Despite debate amongst historians over the merits of counterfactual history, such scholarship is perhaps necessary to identify causal relationships within the historical narrative. Wainwright leaves it to his students to make up their own minds about this debate and the utility of counterfactual speculation and the failure of historical determinism that some games fall into. In the next section, Combat and Brutality, Wainwright turns to role-playing games as the best genre at showcasing violence and combat. Here, Wainwright mistakenly uses the RPG label, as he is really referring to various first-person shooters which fall under the shooter or action genre as we discussed in our previous lecture. These games, such as Call of Duty and Medal of Honor, he argues, may actually soften the brutality of warfare, as injuries are quickly healed, allowing players to return to combat. The absence of civilians, the removing of friendly fire, and the whitewashing of the atrocities committed by Ally soldiers as well, all plague such wargames. Brutality is present in the strategy genre as well. Despite modern sensitivities towards issues such as slavery and the Holocaust, the premise still exists in games like Rome Total War and Europa Universalis. Ultimately, students are asked to consider why certain instances of brutality are obscured, such as African slavery and Nazi Aryanism, while others are allowed, speculating on how this ties into present political sentiments, a game's country of production, and general marketability. The final section of Wainwright's course focuses on gender. Students discuss a variety of historical theories surrounding women and gender studies, as well as the struggle of how game designers can give women agency in their games when female action is not prominent in the historical record. How and if women are either misrepresented or overrepresented becomes a central question for this section. Wainwright likewise leads his class through the transformation of the ever-sexualized archetypal female figure in video games. He goes on to argue that role-playing games, again misunderstanding what this genre entails, are able to do more than strategy games in leading players to experience the social realities of the past, as with games like Assassin's Creed 2. Following this last section, Wainwright concludes his article with a brief discussion of student feedback for the course. 2 questions to consider with this reading are, why do you think Wainwright's course was dominated by white males? Are video games still a fair way to simulate history, or are they themselves intrinsically biased given their market? And 2, which of Wainwright's 7 sections did you find the most engaging? Which do you think does the best at showing historical engagement through video games? Which do you think does the worst? As a final reminder, if you haven't yet, be sure to submit your reading summaries by Sunday night at 10 o'clock. Next week, we will be looking more at historical simulation, as well as the use of video games to represent mythology and the ancient Greeks.